Welcome to the Resilience Interview. My conversation today is with an old friend, Cynthia Eriksson. Cynthia has explored the area of psychological resilience for a number of years, and I'm very grateful for her willingness to share that knowledge with us today. Cynthia, it's really good to be able to talk to you today about resilience. I appreciate your time. From where you sit at the moment, what do you find most interesting about resilience?
Well, it's been interesting to think about, even getting ready for this conversation, John, about how much my own thinking about resilience has shifted and changed as I've grown older, and also different contexts that I've just been living in, listening to, sort of reflecting with, and how much our culture influences how we think about resilience. As a middle class American, I think there's probably ways that I think about resilience as, or I've been socialized to think about resilience as being happy, being able to sort of craft your life in a way that you can get through the tough times and still, be happy and successful, and, the American dream. And, it doesn't take too long of actually looking at that honestly, and you realize what crap that is. And that life is so much more than what maybe our media and society is saying is what's meaningful. And resilience becomes more about the kind of person that I am, the kind of person that I want my children to be. I was thinking today about who I want my boys to be. I have two teenage sons. One is 13 and one is almost 17. And there's a lot of attention in terms of the kind of work they're going to end up doing, what they'll study in university, what kind of jobs they'll get. And I found myself thinking, I most would want to know that they become people that are joyful and generous and kind, and that I honestly don't care too much about what they end up doing. Like, they could be joyful, generous, and kind and drive trash trucks and have really amazing lives, yeah, and bring joy to other people. Yeah. And I think that has helped me then see that, or feel like then when I think about other contexts where people are working in places or living through situations where it really requires them to come face to face and engage daily with deep suffering or really difficult, threatening circumstances, there is still that space or that choice of, am I going to live into a posture that's acknowledges joy, that is generous to others, and that can be kind even in the face of others being hateful.
So it sounds a little bit to me like you're talking about character,
yeah,
and maybe attitude or perspective as well, in terms of this. You made a distinction between joy and happiness. But joy sounds to me like you're saying it's deeper somehow than just being happy. Is that correct?
I think that would be a very accurate way to say it. That happiness is sort of a response to circumstances, and I would see joy as coming from more of an internal posture of being able to see beauty and respond with love, and experience that presence of those things like beauty and love that evoke joy in us, that may be in the context of really difficult circumstances.
So does that mean then, and I'm just following the train of my own thinking here, which goes in different ways, but that means almost, it sounds like you could have an attitude of joy whilst at the same time being sad about something. Almost like sadness and happiness are on one continuum, right, and joy and lack of joy on another, but they don't. you could be filled with joy but still be sad about something. Is that possible?
I just finished a book called Rejoicing in Lament, by a theologian named J. Todd Billings. And I mean, one of his last chapters, he's talking about his own diagnosis as a young man, of an incurable cancer, and the recognition that, there is this choice of life to continue to mourn and rejoice at the same time. That you can hold the sadness of life isn't going to be the way you expected, at the same time as being open to the surprise of love or beauty, or meaning. I think, you mentioned character and purpose. I mean, I think that meaning is part of that as well. Recognizing, and maybe even sometimes, like trying to say, like protesting for meaning, saying, no, God, to bring the divine into this. No, God, I'm going to hold on to the fact that you need to show up here, and you haven't yet, and it feels meaningless, and I'm disoriented, but I'm still just going to keep shaking my fist and saying, when are you going to show up the way you promised to?
Right.
And that you can, in that space of protest and lament, and being honest about your feelings and honest about what's going on inside you, kind of put it out there to the divine and have a posture that's hopeful even in the midst of that. So
it's interesting because back many years ago, when I first started looking at the idea of resilience, that the phrase that was most often bandied around, and I still hear it today, is bounce back from. But what you're describing is a universe that is very much more nuanced and very much deeper and richer than just the idea of having some kind of rubber-like flexibility. This is something rather much more comprehensive. Is that fair for me to say that?
I mean, it makes me sound really wise and smart, so of course you can say that.
Well, of course you are, because why would I not be speaking to you if you weren't wise and smart? I do want to say that I feel like I'm talking about an aspect of resilience that feels deeply important to me, and that there are probably really key issues related to resilience when it comes to physical health, and stamina, and very much healthy relationships. I mean, because I think that those two things are sort of core in terms of your ability to just even physically withstand, those places. And I would say in those moments of deep suffering, one of the most important ways of being able to lament is both the relationship you have with whatever, divine or meaning you find in the world, but it's also having the space to be heard in caring and loving relationships. Right.
So it's all of those things. But I think I'm responding to I agree that there was a season where we were all kind of talking about resilience, and we were using that idea of like the twig that was green inside and that it didn't break, but it would like bounce back. And then we take the metaphor even further, like, there may be permanent changes in how that twig grows, because it's been impacted by what happened, but it's still growing. And maybe there's a part of that I would want to affirm, that I feel like the people who I've seen, whether that's, parents with kids with chronic illness or disability, or it's aid workers who have just, created an amazing culture of space and care in their lives that they've seen and worked through and ministered to others in really deep places of suffering. Or it's the families that you hear making the trek from Syria to find a new life. And you think it's, that there's this aspect of, I'm just going to keep doing what I need to do. I'm going to keep showing up. I'm going to keep choosing to love. I'm going to keep choosing to forgive. I'm going to keep choosing to learn and to know that I can be a different person, and I'm going to be taught something in this. And I mean, that there is a greenness in that, right? That ability to say, I can grow, I can learn. I don't know I don't know what I'm going to look like in the end. And that's okay, rather than sort of holding on kind of a rigid view of success or resilience or bouncing back to what you were before,
because that part there, I think, is part of the issue that I have with that idea, that metaphor of resilience, is that the implication that you can be under a lot of stress or strain or pressure and you bounce back to some state where you were before, where we know from our own lives that we get through things and we cope with things. At least I speak for myself. I cope with things, I get through things, I grow from things. But to say that I'm the same person as I was prior to that, it's not true. I'm aspects of what I was before, but I'm aspects of something rather different. And so it may be a bouncing, but it's not necessarily a bouncing back, at least not for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think that rubbery sort of model has this idea that there's a certain way that you're supposed to be, and that, it's in this particular outline, and that if you're resilient, whatever impinges on that outline doesn't affect how you look at the end.
Right.
And I mean, I think that the post-traumatic growth research and adversarial growth and work that people have talked about meaning making, they do a great job of pointing out that there is the positive potential coming out of suffering and coming out of traumatic experiences.
You put meaning earlier. You said meaning was really important in terms of I guess opening up doorways for the future. How can you talk a little bit more about meaning and that? I guess meaning's got something to do with identity. It's got something to do with our belief, maybe our faith. How does that? How do you see that working in terms of this context?
Yeah. I want to give credit to Crystal Park, who is a writer who's done a tremendous amount, and researcher who's done a tremendous amount to bring to light kind of the ideas of meaning making. And there are others. A colleague of mine, Joe Currier, has been doing research in that area, because there's another earlier researcher who talks about meaning having kind of three aspects, and I found this really helpful. I'm only going to remember the first two, but the two that kind of really struck with me is how much when things happen to us, we look for meaning in a way of comprehensibility, to try to understand what happened. How easy it is to blame ourselves or to find some kind of way of making sense of all the circumstances so that it just makes sense. But then the other piece of meaning is significance, that we want it to we want to be able to hold that it was a significant experience. And I think sometimes people who've experienced trauma get kind of caught in that, because it's almost like, in order to hold on to the significance, it becomes the center point of their life as opposed to just one chapter of their life. So I know when we do trauma work with people that are recovering from trauma, so much of the storytelling is helping to see, yes, the significance in terms of how it's been part of their life and how it's impacted them, but that doesn't have to be who they are, and sort of shifting that. But then there's other ways that we put significance on certain choices we might make, like, think about an aid worker who has a really deep humanitarian motivation. And the significance is, I want to give back, to the world, or I want to serve, or I want to stand up for human rights, or, I want to be able to act against evil. I think there's a way that our choices in caregiving kinds of roles, there's a deep significance in what it means to put ourselves in places where we are holding the pain of others, or we are seeking to protect or care for others. That adds a significance and a purpose, in our own lives.
As we grow older, we often find that our focus of significance changes, doesn't it? Or what we have, what is most meaningful for us at one stage in our lives changes as we get on. So it almost sounds to me like you're describing resilience as, or this area of resilience as being a journey where we're constantly growing, changing, evolving, having different viewpoints. Is that fair comment? It's not something like a state we reach and once we've got there, it's done. Now I can do something else.
I think that's a very fair way to articulate it. And maybe this is where I'm sort of shifting around, sort of talking about resilience, but then also thinking about personal transformation or personal formation or, personal well-being. I think, it just makes me think too, John, of what you're saying, what we were saying before about sort of the rubber model, the rubber metaphor, is that I think when I was young, I had this idea of that you get ready to do something and then success is doing it well and sort of like sustaining the job.
Yeah.
And I think about that for when I started teaching at Fuller Seminary. I co-teach a class that's called Self-Care and Mission. And I co-teach it with a colleague from the School of Intercultural Studies here at Fuller. And we started teaching back in 2000 or 1999. And I was like this newly graduated psychologist doing research in this area of trauma and on the field. And I remember very intentionally thinking about the class being a way to get everyone like ready and geared up, so that they could go out on the field and be resilient, and I, over time, Jude and I have taught that class together maybe 8 or 9 times. And over time, I think we both came to this recognition of, wait a second, that's not the purpose of the class. The purpose of the class is to really actually challenge that idea in the students. And to say, look, actually, this whole idea of what you're planning to do in terms of going out and doing ministry or going out and doing cross-cultural mission, God wants you to take the posture that this is mutual transformation.
Right.
That just as you are bringing hope and, a sense of purpose and wanting to see reconciliation, wanting to see development happen in certain areas, God, that same growth and peace and transformation is something that should be happening in you at the same time. In your relationships with the people you're working with in the local community, in your relationships with your team, in how you pursue your personal spiritual disciplines, that this is about you growing and becoming healed at the same time as you're bringing growth and healing to others.
So there's a real dynamic, a social dynamic going on here then, isn't there? Yeah. When you're talking about, it seems to me you're saying that there's stuff we do for ourselves, but that the interaction with others in our social group or outside our social group is really important in terms of resilience for not only me but for you and for others as well. Is that right? It's a dynamic.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's that openness. How do I put this? I mean, it sounds really silly, or maybe not silly, but simplistic. Is like it's an openness to growing and to being changed. That when think about the people that that have been really successful in, and maybe in professional terms, successful in cross-cultural settings, is they're willing to see the ways that their culture gets things wrong.
Yeah.
They're willing to be changed in the process. They're willing to learn a new way. It may even be a slower way of doing something, but they're willing to learn it and do it and see the ways that it might end up being better. So as an American, when it's all about efficiency, it's that there's this, and then even as I say that, I realize there's a joyfulness in that learning.
Yeah.
Because then you've also sort of given up this idea that somehow I have to have the answers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a lot of freedom in that.
Yeah. So we've got, I'm just thinking back over our conversation, we've got character, we've got joy, we've got openness. So character, joy, openness. I just want to just a slight change here in terms of we've talked a lot about individuals, and both you and I come from cultures where the individual is kind of like the societal focal point.
Yeah.
But many cultures in the world, it's not that. It's kind of like a kinship group or a family group or something or other. How does this map across, do you think, to other cultures? The ideas of character, joy, openness, resilience, but not so much on an individual level.
That's a really thought-provoking question. I mean, what's interesting to me is I feel like there's the reminder that developing character and the experience of joy is something that's intended to be shared. That it's not sort of an experience that's about, me and look at how great I've formed or felt, but it's in what I do with that, how I serve others, how I engage my community, how I take risks, how I think about sacrifice when I'm called to sacrifice time, resources, those things that wouldn't be my typical human sort of response to do. And it's interesting because I think the easiest place for me to imagine how this gets lived out is both in the family unit, and what it means to live as a family that values a posture of character and a posture of joy, but then also what it means to live that out in a church community or a community of faith that may or may not be at a similar spot. So I think about your questions about culture as a whole. I think I'm going to actually cite one of my own students. One of my students went to Uganda and did interviews with sort of local leaders in some of the areas of northern Uganda where former child soldiers and women that had been used as sex slaves in the communities were returning to develop new homes, new places, new villages. And so she asked them the question of what does recovery look like? And this is my student who just graduated. So it's Dr. Nikki Frederick. And I told her she has to get her dissertation published.
Absolutely.
But she asked the question of what does recovery look like? What does well-being look like in this community? What does it look like for men? What does it look like for women? And then, took tremendous amount of time to sort through the kinds of answers that she got. And as you would expect, there is a lot of, well-being means having a plow. Well-being means having money to run a business. Well-being means having food that I need. But embedded over all of that, which was so amazing and such a lesson for us as Americans, embedded in over that was that it was completely linked to how having that thing allows me to serve the community.
Right.
And that so well-being was not just me having the plow, it was me having the plow so I could plow my neighbor's field. And I just was it just always came out in the same sentence. So there wasn't this sense of just me,
right.
And my recovery or my well-being or my resilience,
right.
But it was really thinking about the whole community in the framework of what does it mean for things to go better, to be better.
Is this part of too that circling back again to that other point you made about faith? Because it seems that just about every kind of faith, whether it's religious faith or other faith, is a communal thing, unless it's so self-absorbed that it's become narcissistic. But there's something communal about faith and meaning, isn't there? There's something or other about my meaning is not separated from the community I'm with, whether it's a worshipping community or whether it's a scientific endeavor or a commercial enterprise. We've got shared meaning as a group, which gives me purpose, identity, a look for the future. Is there a connection between faith and meaning and community and resilience, or am I stretching it too far here?
I'm sure there is. It's what I sit back and think about is a little bit like the difference between, what Nikki was finding felt very much of a cultural, that the village culture. And some of them articulated a particular faith and would talk about the role of the church in that, or church leaders in that. But I think I would want to also kind of connect to sort of maybe one of the words that we use around here at Fuller is sort of when we think about faith that's really functional. So I do think that there's a functional component of participating in a certain community and a certain faith tradition that gives you like doctrines, or it gives you a framework of what it means to think about growing or being transformed. So there's that sort of intellectual, functional way of thinking about faith that I do think is connected to resilience. It's like you got a community of people who've created a resource for you in that way. But then I would also sort of want to reflect on for a faith community that is wanting to hold on to the reality of the divine, and sort of the unexpected ways that God can work, that becomes another level of an attachment relationship, another way of being known, another way of being seen and transformed, that becomes something supernatural. So I think there's probably ways, like when you said a scientific endeavor, I think there's probably ways that a community and sort of the hope in the scientific process, and the community all seeking to do their best work to reach this particular goal, that there's a lot of meaning in that, and there's a purpose in that I think can help people sort of get through the times that the experiments aren't working the way you intended, or you have to go and get more funding, or you hit these different blocks that keep going, sort of the perseverance piece of this. And then there's the kind of back to the lament. There's I'm going to keep persevering, but I'm going to also shake my fist at God and say, when are you going to show up? Because I believe that you actually have the capacity to come in and change things radically. And I may or may not see that in my life, but I'm going to trust, and in my community, trust in the doctrine of, what the Psalms say about who God is.
It's interesting. I was just thinking when you were talking about the scientific endeavor thing, I saw a really brilliant documentary, which name escapes me right now, but I'm sure I'll find, about CERN, the big particle accelerator underneath Geneva. It's a massive, big scientific experiment. And one of the things that struck me was interviews with the scientists working there. And there are thousands of scientists from all over the world working there. And she was saying that one of the best things about working there was this whole feeling of expecting the unexpected, the feeling of excitement, the feeling of a community, testing things out. And because of that, it spun off a whole series of creative ideas that she said she never would have got if she'd been working by herself in a lab somewhere other else around the world. And it was something about being surrounded by all these creative, optimistic, exciting people that also then spun off a whole lot more creation and optimism and excitement and discovery. So there's social kind of fabric coming into play there as well.
And I think I'd want to add too, when you were describing that, it made me think of the importance in, various religious traditions, the importance of testimony, of people being able to share their narrative of what they've gone through and the ways that they've changed, and the hope that they've found. And that there are times when, by hearing a story of someone who's been through something that you can hardly imagine yourself facing, when you hear them tell the story of how they've been held and cared for, and whether that's practically through the local community or ways that they have felt the divine presence in the midst of it, that those add to my hope. It's like becomes this larger community story of hopefulness and finding beauty and joy in the midst of those times.
As I remember, I've done quite a lot of work in Africa, and I was talking with an African colleague who very gently reminded me that that for much of human history, the way we transmit meaning across generations and social groups is by telling stories rather than running scientific experiments. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And he said, if you want to talk about resilience and growth and strength in an African context, we've got to tell our stories, and we've got to hear our stories, and that's how I get to know you, is when you tell me your story. I thought, that's interesting. It's a different way of doing it from the peer-reviewed, scientific, purely objective kind of narrative that we sometimes default to in the West. So here's a final question. Well, not a final question, but getting towards the end, a question for you then. Okay. So I come to you and I say to you, Cynthia, look, I want to do something that's going to build my resilience and keep me strong. What are some things that I can do linked to what you've been talking about here? We'll put to one side and say I'm super fit. I eat a great diet. None of which is true. But all those things I've attended to. But I've come to you and I say now a little bit deeper. What can I do to really help me? Build resilience, enhance resilience, maintain resilience as I go forward?
So I actually would, at this point in my life, be a strong proponent of contemplative practices as a component of that in terms of building resilience related to the experience of joy, of reflecting on, the transformation that's happening in your life, the ability to tolerate negative affect, to be in it, and then also sort of experience things that aren't negative. And so how I particularly describe that is, I have found I've been doing for the last several years a couple things. One is the Ignatian Examen prayer.
Yes.
Just simply an opportunity to review the previous 24 hours. But it also, the model that I use starts with recognizing being loved by God. So just kind of this consistent connection to something greater than myself, and that love is at the center of that, not meaninglessness or purposelessness, but that love really is the beginning. And
right.
To quote Gerald May, I'm going to read something off of my bulletin board, that love should come first. It should be the beginning of and the reason for everything. And that's Gerald May, the psychiatrist. But so love, gratitude, and then reflecting on the previous day in terms of the things where I felt sort of meaningfully moved, and maybe God was present, or things I felt like I didn't act the way in terms of being the person that I want to be, and even asking for forgiveness for that, or reflecting on ways that I might need to even do acts of restitution, or asking forgiveness from that person. And then in that space of sort of being open to the learning that's happening for me in that particular moment, of then thinking about my next day, this coming day, and offering it again with a sense of gratitude and wonder what's going to happen. And, and I'm open to the life that is coming my way. And there's ways that connects to meaning, ways that connects to sort of my own ability to discern what's happening in my life, even in the moment, so it's like the experience of reflecting on the previous day gives me better muscles to think about things that are happening as they happen, and to kind of go, ooh, that wasn't really what I wanted to say. Let me take that back. But then also, it also has helped me to be more comfortable with silence. To just, because that process is happening in silence, and I think that neuropsychology and neurophysiology is helping us realize more and more of the kinds of practices we can do, like contemplative prayer or meditation and mindfulness, that help us to actually strengthen our parasympathetic nervous system. And so these experiences of doing more contemplative practices, I feel like, have helped me internally be more calm as well. So physiologically, so not just that sense of feeling more joyful and feeling more connected in my own sense of purpose and who I am, who God's made me to be, but then also just able to react, to not be as reactive, I should say, and just be more calm in the day.
Right.
I feel like that is a resource that it is a discipline. It does take time to practice those things, and when we're working in environments that have a lot of stress, sometimes it's hard to imagine taking 20 minutes to be silent.
Right.
But I do really feel like that is a primary way that we have some resources at our fingertips to practice and to move into and to see that develop.
So if I wasn't a religious person, I could start off at a point of recognizing that I am loved, that I have value,
yes,
and that I value myself as well as others value me, and that my place in the universe is valuable, mm-hmm. that I have meaning, that paying attention to the way in which I interact with other people and with the environment, the context around me is important, because as I do that and reflect on that, it gives me choices. It opens up choices for me about how I might behave in future.
Absolutely.
And so I have control. I have a sense of, or some control over what I do tomorrow that I didn't do today. And the more choices I make that are positive, the more likely it is that will reinforce my original assumption that I am valuable, that I'm loved, and that I have meaning. So in a sense, it's, if I understand correctly, that's a kind of like a faith journey. It's not necessarily a religious journey, although there's no reason why it couldn't be a religious journey.
Right.
But there's some faith in who I am, the fact that I am lovable, that I'm loved, and that there's faith that that I have some control, and faith that meaning through my actions is something rather that I can see happen. Yeah. But that means I have to pay attention to that, doesn't it? That's exactly what you're talking about.
Well, and I think you're highlighting that one of the important pieces of that discipline is reflection. And I think the thing I would want to just shift, slightly nuance is using the word control, is I think your earlier way of sort of phrasing it is I have choice, that there's always going to be options, that even in situations that truly are uncontrollable, I will have a choice in how I respond, and that's where I can draw in some of my questions about where I find meaning or what feels purposeful, is the choices that I'm making can draw me closer to that purpose or to that ultimate sense of meaning, or they can draw me away, and that I have that opportunity. Yeah.
But also recognizing too that some people, maybe many people, live in contexts where it's really quite hard to believe that I could be loved.
Yeah.
And it's really quite hard to believe that things that I do might actually help me. And I mean, I know that for most people that isn't the case, but it does happen, doesn't it? That sometimes contexts are so toxic, and our upbringing's been so toxic that it can be quite hard to figure a way through that. Yeah. And that reality is unfortunately true, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're creating a great segue for me to share something that I wanted to share that I wasn't sure how I was going to fit it in. But I think I had this experience watching the movie 12 Years a Slave, which is such a phenomenal movie and so difficult in terms of the ways it represents how white Americans have committed evil acts, and I mean, it's so awful. So exactly what you described, circumstances that should never have been, putting African Americans, African slaves in these situations that were impossible to manage. And I remember watching that movie and being so struck by how, for one scene, you would be seeing the whippings happen or the lynching happen, and your heart is breaking for the the evil and the mistreatment and the injustice that's happening. And then there would be a scene of incredible beauty, of this mist sort of floating over a swampland that were just, it was just breathtaking. And I thought to myself, that's exactly what it means to move through suffering, is that you are recognizing and saying the truth about the suffering and about the injustice and about the evil that's going on, but you also can have glimpses of this extraordinary beauty.
Right.
And that coming back to the communal piece of then those of us who are in positions where we can act against that injustice, we need to, you know, that's part of our responsibility and how, what our call is in the meaning and that purpose. But for those that are caught and feel very disempowered, how are there ways that they can still have eyes that see hope and beauty and love? Yeah.
Which gets back to that paying attention thing. If there's something or other that I can do in my present circumstances, it's to try and pay attention to everything that's around me, and look for those little, maybe very small spots of beauty, that evidence of life. Mm-hmm. And try and focus on those, whether it's a memory that I have or whether it's something in my particular environment. So, so paying attention, the reflecting part is a really core component of this for resilience. I'm going to call us to a close because we're running out of time and you have places to be. But just before I say thank you again, is there anything else that you wanted to say that you haven't said that you need to say?
Well, I think in light of what we were just saying at the end, I'd want to highlight gratitude. That in that space of reflection and, like you were saying, kind of being able to remember and be reminded of being loved and of seeing beauty is sort of a posture of gratitude. Okay. Even in those places of suffering. So
character, joy, openness, and gratitude, in a context of reflection and paying attention, are kind of things that we could put together in our repertoire of enhancing resilience.
Yes.
And I'm sure this doesn't do justice to everything that you have thought about this. So we might just have to look at, having another discussion a bit later, more deep and meaningful.
Well, what's great is that you're having conversations with so many different people, because then you're getting just all the different facets.
Yeah.
Because I think that's why I just feel like I have this tiny glimpse of what's been really meaningful to me, and the ways that I feel like it's important for me to live my life. And that might feel like the most important thing because it's my thing. But what's great is that you're getting the chance to get the variety of perspectives.
Yeah. It's a fascinating topic because it doesn't have this clear definition of what resilience is. So that's what really interests me about it, is that it's just such a fascinating area, as you say. Look, thanks very much, Cynthia, for joining us today. And I look forward to talking with you again in the future sometime.
Thank you, John. Take care.
Thank you.